Before we dive into today's discussion, I wanted to extend a heartfelt thank you to Civil Rights Heritage Center Assistant Director and Curator George Garner for sharing his expertise and insights with us. I would also like to express our gratitude to Indiana Humanities for making this event possible. Their commitment to supporting educational and community-focused initiatives plays a vital role in fostering dialogue and understanding on critical issues like civil rights. As we delve into the stories of individuals who have fought for their rights and the collective efforts that have driven change, I encourage you to reflect on how these historical narratives resonate with our current social landscape. South Bend's own civil rights journey reminds us of the resilience and determination required to effect meaningful change and the importance of continued advocacy. Now, this program will run for approximately 1 hour, with Mr. Garner speaking for about 30 minutes and then 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. Thank you once again for being here and for your commitment to understanding and addressing these critical issues. Without further ado, I give the floor to George Garner.
Casey, thank you so much. Not only appreciating that introduction, but appreciating the work that you're doing on that Resist exhibition. I had the privilege of serving as one of the advisory board members for it and was really intrigued by the way that you developed that exhibition and the conversation that you're trying to hold about the way people have looked to push back against entrenched hatred and entrenched white supremacy and the various ways that people have looked at that over time. That story that you tell and Resist is a part of our story here as well that we've been talking about. So thank you again. My name is George. I've had the privilege and pleasure of serving on staff here at what's now the Indiana University South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center. I've served on staff for about 12 years, currently in the role of assistant director and curator. And so my goal is to spend this amount of time taking a deep dive, pun intended, into the history of this space and how it has evolved over time. What is now today the Indiana University South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center started its life as the Angman Public Natatorium. And those three words are important to it. I'll just start with that third word first, natatorium, much like gymnasium, much like auditorium, much like aquarium. Natatorium is simply a Latin word that means place to swim. And when it opened in 1922, it was the city of South Bend's first municipally owned indoor swimming pool. And the era that it opened, the early 1920s, marks a really important line in our state's history when over 50% of workers in Indiana are now working in industrial manufacturing settings and based in cities as opposed to small subsistence level farms. And with that new majority of people working in industries growing higher and higher, the growth of those industries was tied to the growth of the workforces living in the cities around them. And so city after city after city has to figure out how to entice people to leave their small rural country farms and come to those large brick and concrete jungles like ours. And they do that by taking steps that we largely take for granted today. Things like surfacing roads. Most roads in a city like ours would have been brick, or in this photo here, this was brick that you can see here. In some cases, just dirt in the early decades of the 20th century, particularly outside of downtown. The further outside you get into that core, particularly neighborhoods with a high concentration of either poor people or people of color, were not prioritized. There were some sections of South Bend that did not get paved roads until the end of the 1960s. Things like outdoor electric lights are a new thing, just to be able to go outside and see. And especially for our purposes, sewer systems for indoor plumbing, like showers and toilets. These really don't become ubiquitous until the late 1920s, and still not among lower socioeconomic classes. These technologies are all relatively new and are hugely disrupting old ways of living. And so, with that huge influx of people moving from rural environments to urban ones, cities also start looking at the rural world that people are leaving behind. And they start carving out these natural spaces inside the city to coexist with the human made spaces. This is why New York City carved out a huge swath of incredibly financially valuable land inside Manhattan to serve as Central Park. They could have sold that land for more skyscrapers, but instead they made the deliberate decision to value the natural world alongside the unnatural world. Many additional cities crafted similar spaces, like Indianapolis's Military Park and South Bend's Howard Park that I'm showing here. And also for a city on a natural waterway like ours, a lot of people were afraid that leaving behind the rural creeks and waterways meant that fewer and fewer people knew how to swim. And the risk of drowning was a risk that people wanted to address. As early as 1881, public calls to reduce the abundance of drowning deaths in South Bend's St. Joseph River arose. The South Bend Tribune stated, quote, where there are so many deaths from drowning as we have in this city, a building for bathing and swimming purposes is really a necessity as much as a luxury. The clip that I'm showing here comes 6 years later, and the Tribune's call feels even louder, quoting, "Our city has never yet had a place to swim where boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen could learn to swim, except the treacherous river where from 3 to 6 lives are lost every summer." By 1893, that call is growing louder still, with the Tribune again stating a crying need of South Bend is a natatorium. It has been talked of and written of, and schemes have been proposed, but as yet, nothing of the kind has developed. Elkhart opened a natatorium in 1887, but South Bend did not have an official, publicly owned one until the Angman Natatorium opened in late June 1922. And when it opened, it was a big deal. This is from a 1922 book called South Bend World Famed. And you can see they labeled the natatorium as a great asset. An estimated 1,000 swimmers came during its first week alone. And over the ensuing decades, thousands of South Bend's residents first learned to swim here. And I meet many people who remember and share their stories. For many, this was a building where you went to with your friends that the public could come and use in many different ways. This is what we believe you would have seen when you first climbed the steps to enter the natatorium. We believe it's the original 1922 ticket booth. And depending on who you were, different things would have happened. If you were like me, you'd put down your dime, then go off to the boys' changing room on the right to change your clothes, take a shower, then head back to where the pool was. Interesting fact, to this day, I can't swim. So it's an historic irony that I work for an old swimming pool. The girls' changing room is on the left there. They too would come in, turn left, change, and head out to the pool, likely without giving it a second thought. But I ask you to look at that word in the photo on the left there. It says public. That word was carved into the limestone right above the main entrance. And I think a lot about who might have actually carved that word. I don't know who it was specifically, but I ask some questions and I try to make some informed guesses about who that person may have been. To this day, stonework, construction work, it is a heavily gendered field. It tends to swing very heavily male, certainly not exclusively, but it leans in that direction. And that would have been significantly more true in 1922. So I think it's a reasonable guess to presume that the person who carved it was male identified. And then further, based on the demographics of South Bend in the 1920s, it's also a reasonable guess that it was a white male who carved it. Now, to be clear, I have zero evidence to back that and support that claim at all. But I am going to take the 98, 99% probability, and I'm going to risk that assumption. Because what I do know and what we can prove is that in 1925, nearly 1 out of every 5 non-immigrant white men in St. Joseph County was a member of the terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. And so I wonder, was the guy who carved this, could he have been one of them? And if so, when he is carving that word, to whom is he applying its meaning toward? Again, I have no idea. I don't know who he was, and I don't know what he felt in his heart. I can't say whether he was or wasn't a good person. Quite frankly, I don't care because I'm not thinking about the intentions that he had when he was doing that. All I know is the impact of the work. That word was carved. And so too was the name of South Bend's mayor, all of the people who sat on the South Bend City Council, all white men. And from 1922 to 1936, African American people were denied entry here, period. And beginning in 1936, it began segregating by day. So how can it have been called public? And what did it mean that a portion of that public that looks as I do specifically and deliberately denied the meaning of that word to include all human beings? That was a violent act that impacted thousands upon thousands of people in South Bend for almost 30 years. Many are familiar with the story of segregation as it was practiced in the Deep South in the United States. It meant some portion of the public putting up signs limiting access to other parts of the public for various public facilities, white and black water fountains, white and black sections of a movie theater, refusing service at restaurants. Indiana, like most northern states, did not have state laws requiring segregation. It was, in fact, the opposite. Although the Indiana Constitution in 1851 did specifically bar African American and biracial people from settling and doing business in Indiana, that was overturned in 1864. And by 1888, we had a civil rights protection law on the books making it illegal to deny entry to a person based on skin color. It was not enforced, however. The failure of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era deeply impacted not only formerly enslaved African Americans in the South, but both free and formerly enslaved people living in the North as well. The hope was that at the end of the Civil War and the formal abolishment of enslavement, that people who were once enslaved would be integrated into the American public. That hope was quickly dashed. White supremacy continued, and a new racial caste system evolved. In the US South, Jim Crow put these racial hierarchies into law, requiring separate water fountains, bathrooms, schools, train and bus sections, not to mention jobs and housing. This is where the KKK first develops as a way to use mob violence to enforce those racial hierarchies. Racial terror lynchings took the lives of over 4,400 people from 1877 to 1950, and that included 18 individuals in Indiana but also 56 in Illinois and many other non-Southern states like New York, Montana, and Utah. In the face of the most brutal and violent post-Civil War racism in the South, millions of African Americans make the decision to move north. This is one of the largest movements of humans in the entirety of Earth's history, impacting millions of people. And as the racism of the South is pushing people out, you have factories and companies in the North that are pulling people in. It's like a magnet pulling more and more people to a perception of safety and economic mobility. And you can pick just about any city from the Midwest to the Northeast, and the patterns are very similar, from Indianapolis to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo. Each city is radically transformed in the span of a couple of decades. And in South Bend, this is where companies like Studebaker come in. Studebaker formed here in the mid-19th century and became one of the world's largest covered wagon manufacturers, one of the only ones to survive that hugely disruptive technology, the automobile. Studebaker was the largest industrial employer of African Americans in South Bend, but only in some of the dirtiest and the most dangerous jobs. And this is why a photo like this one is just really striking to me. I don't know who any of the individuals are. I imagine the four on the left could be of Eastern European descent, Eastern European immigrants. And it is worth noting that there were layers and levels of discrimination against them as well. Some of you may have heard the phrase, no Irish need apply. So even Irish people thought of as this kind of subcategory of human. However, for their kids and their kids' kids, that form of discrimination kind of largely flattens out, right? We don't talk about Irish American or Polish American discrimination today. Well, that's not true for the person on the right. For his kids and his kids' kids, they're still living with that form of racism and discrimination. And also for the person on the right, that pathway to jobs in the North is seen as an escape out of the worst of the worst of the Jim Crow South. Again, I don't know who he was, but perhaps he himself was a sharecropper working on a rural farm. Perhaps he was the son or grandson of somebody who had been formerly enslaved. If he's living through the worst of Jim Crow racism, then a factory job at a place like Studebaker is considered this pathway out of that. And thousands upon thousands take that pathway to South Bend. Our African-American population starts growing significantly from about 600 individuals in 1910, but doubling to 1,200 by 1920, and then nearly tripling to 3,400 by 1930. And it continues to grow not only in raw numbers, but as a percentage of the population as time goes on. But this is how the Klan evolves into a nationwide organization. It leaves the US South and becomes this national phenomenon. Indiana's governor was a card-carrying member in 1924, and we opened in 1922. So none of that is an excuse for, but an explanation of how this space that I'm in opened and specifically decided to deny entry to African-American people. Now, I don't know how clearly this image is coming through for all of you, but if you're able to see the logo on their swimsuits, it's the University of Notre Dame logo. Their swim team competed in regional competitions that were held at the Engman Public Natatorium. And I think this gives us a really important entryway into a conversation not only about the Klan, but how people from other identity groups, like white Catholics, can both experience oppression themselves, as well as take on oppressive behaviors. Those two opposing forces can easily live inside one human being. Casey had mentioned that the powerful exhibition Resist, where this is part of that story. It talks about an attempted march by the Klan through downtown South Bend in 1924 that was violently disrupted by Notre Dame students gathering in order to try to both subvert and in some cases using violent disruption against this threat to themselves. While it is true that Notre Dame students, as Catholics, rightly perceived the Klan as a threat to their existence, it's worth noting by no means was the Klan only anti-Black. The Klan was anti anything that wasn't both white and Protestant. So that included Jewish people and included Catholic people as well. They were right to perceive the Klan as a threat to their existence. It is also true that the university did not regularly admit African American students until the 1940s, nor women until the 1970s. And the photo that I'm showing was taken about 15 feet away from me inside this building, inside this whites only swimming pool. So how does that work, right? That one human being can be a target of this white supremacist organization, but also engage in anti-Black behavior themselves. And I think it's really important for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, no matter those cultural or social identifying markers, to really do that work to kind of deconstruct and reconstruct and think about that. I don't want to oversell this too much, but how does it work that in some Black churches have known to be homophobic and anti-LGBTQ? How does that work that an African American person who has undoubtedly experienced racism their entire life can take on anti-LGBTQ behavior, right? And what does it mean that instead of thinking about who we are against, who are we for? And how do we think not only of our own selves, but of other people as well? What does it mean if everybody in this world started doing that? And what kind of world would we build if we think that? The reaction to exclusion at the natatorium was formed by a group of mostly African American group of doctors, lawyers, and politicians working inside the system to effect change. There are, of course, many individuals who had an impact and many different forms that their activism took. I start with just a few. The gentleman on the right is Mr. Jesse Dickinson. Mr. Dickinson was a newspaper reporter and later a state representative who also helped the natatorium open to the entire public. I believe Indiana Historical Society has a collection of some of his records and papers. The woman in the middle is Elizabeth Fletcher Allen. And then on the left is her husband, J. Chester Allen. They were a husband and wife lawyer team in the 1930s. Please allow me to repeat that, a husband and wife lawyer team. So I think it's really worth noting that she not only earned a law degree in an era where men made that extraordinarily difficult, but she used that degree and that privilege to speak out against injustice. Since they were lawyers, they used the tools at their disposal, the law. And they did so by asking a key question. If a public building is supported by public tax dollars, don't African Americans pay taxes too? With the natatorium being city-owned and operated and taxpayer funded, this became a focus of local activist action. In the early 1930s, major repairs on the less than 10-year-old building led the city to petition the state for permission to add an additional tax. This is a common thing that happens all the time for public projects. And this is where the lawyers found their hook, arguing that a taxpayer-funded site should be equally accessible to all taxpayers. And they took that petition to the state. But they did this in 1936. About 10 years after our governor was a card-carrying member of the Klan. The state was willing to stipulate that African American people deserved access to a site their tax dollars were supporting, but they were not ready to agree that Black and white swimmers should swim together. So it's the state that ordered the city to segregate entry by day, one day a week on a Monday. Unlike the South, where laws led to signs telling people where to go, to the best of my knowledge, there was no sign on the natatorium dictating when entry was permitted. And while laws required equal access, challenging those laws was, as we see, difficult and often did not yield equal access. So most people either didn't bother trying to come into this space that had for so long denied their humanity, or they maybe learned from others that it was segregated, or they found out the hard way, like this little girl here. This is a young Barbara Vance Brandy. She remembers her grandmother making her a red swimsuit and getting all set to go into the natatorium to learn to swim. I'll let her tell you the story of what happened to her.
Water, while it soothes and cools, it can sometimes burn and leave a scar.
My grandmother made me a bathing suit and it was red. And we walked to the natatorium. And as we walked up the steps, I looked at my mother and I said, why are they staring at us? Because I had never been confronted with bigotry before. And she said, just keep walking, Barbara. So we walked up the steps and one of the gentlemen said, you can't swim today. There's certain times when you can swim and there's certain times when you can't. To this day, I hate the color red.
It is worth pausing and noting that the natatorium was not the only place that denied entry to people. Almost every place did. What was the Palace Theater in the background of this photograph of the heart of downtown South Bend is now the Morris Performing Arts Center. It once had a section only for African Americans. And I won't show it here, but if you're familiar with the history of blackface, white people putting on makeup and acting out incredibly offensive caricatures of African American people, our archival collection has a photograph of a blackface show held at the Palace. And there are more stories as well. More people joined the fight to integrate the natatorium. And finally, after 30 years of activists pushing people towards change, in 1950, formal segregation at the natatorium ends. But that legacy of segregation, the hurt that it caused, remains. In addition to the injustices of the past, new injustices are making new waves every single day. Segregation, racism, white supremacy, these have not ended. It is not a part of our past. It is a part of our present. The people in this photo are marching in New York in 1917 to draw attention to the incredible violence of lynching victims. People in this photo are participating in the March on Washington in 1963, organized by Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and headlined by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Between 200 to 300,000 marchers descended on the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal voting, employment, and other basic rights. This is downtown South Bend in June 2019, after a white South Bend police officer ended the life of an unarmed Black man named Eric Logan. And this is downtown South Bend in June 2020, after a white police officer ended the life of an unarmed Black man in Minneapolis named George Floyd. Segregation has evolved, certainly, but there are countless stories from millions of people across the United States making clear how this is not history. And to pick just some of the most famous examples, I think of April 12th, 2018, when two Black men were arrested at a Starbucks in Philadelphia after a manager called 911 to say they were occupying a table without buying anything. The men said they were waiting to meet a business associate when police were called on them about 3 minutes after they sat down. I think of July 2018, when a white San Francisco woman called police on an 8-year-old girl for selling bottled water without a permit outside of an apartment building. In May 2020, in New York Central Park, a Black science fiction officer correctly informed a woman that her unleashed dog needed to be leashed. She called 911. In November 2022, a 9-year-old in New Jersey was outside her home experimenting with a homemade formula to remove a bug infestation from trees when a neighbor called 911, identifying her as a white woman with a hood. And just last year, less than a year ago, in November 2023, an Army vet in New York was sitting in his car outside a family member's house when an off-duty plainclothes police approached him. When he informed him about a gun he had legally purchased and had in his glove box, he was immediately ordered to step out of the car and questioned about how he could have gotten his military ID. The natatorium, too, was never truly fully integrated. And I've heard stories that depending on who was working the ticket booth that day, the pool might be full for Black swimmers while others were allowed in. It is true, though, that the expectation here changed from one of systemic segregation to one of presumed integration. But by 1978, the Natatorium was no longer used as a shining example of South Bend being a world-famous city. It's over 50 years old. And with companies like Studebaker and so many others closing their factories one by one for the thousands of African-American workers who were denied access to equal education and who, because of housing discrimination, were unable to relocate to new communities, the changes in industrialization and suburbanization hit especially hard. Yet, instead of investing more money into the natatorium, the city decided to shut it down. And here it's at for 30 more years, broken, abandoned, and falling apart. I have a different incredible photo of a thin line of snow over one of the ladders to get into the pool because the roof overhead had just completely caved in. That is until Indiana University students took steps to make change. So we run a class out of IU South Bend every 2 to 4 years, and the class is called Freedom Summer. Changes a little bit, but a cohort of roughly a dozen to a dozen and a half students board a charter bus during one of the summer sessions. This is for credit. They drive through the U.S. South for 10 to 14 days roughly, and they learn the 1950 1960s movement for justice in places where it happened and from people who made it happen. And these are the iconic places: Selma, Alabama, Montgomery, Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis. They meet people at every step of the way who were part of that movement and that are sharing their stories and talking about their life's history and trajectory and their involvement with that movement and what it meant for them. Many of them were college students at the time. And so for college students now to hear those reflections is really powerful. That first class was in 2000, and the cohort that came back not only deeply transformed, but also very deeply curious. What was South Bend's role in this movement? What was happening here? They sought information, but found information very hard to come by. Frankly, our historical institutions were not sharing those stories. And so it's a group that decided to form us first as an on-campus research wing with the expressed mission of studying local history on the campus of IU South Bend. And our first project was an oral history project that exists to this day. We've recorded now over 200 separate interviews. It's an incredible treasure trove of local story. And it's in those first interviews that the story of the natatorium kept getting repeated, not only as a space of pain for those like Barbara Brandy who had experienced discrimination, but as a space of resilience for the lawyers, doctors, and many others who organized in order to try to push back against that. The students were learning the 1930s, 1950s movement for justice in this building, but drove by and saw a building that was vacant and abandoned and boarded up. And there was no plaque. There was no monument, right? There was nothing. You could so easily drive by and have no concept of what had happened here in that push for justice during the 1930s to 1950s. So again, they decided to ask, what role can we play? What steps can we take? And I'm putting years of work into like 3 sentences. I can't do this justice. But in 2010, they've transformed and reopened the space as a community home for the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center. That woman in white coming in is the little girl, Barbara Brandy. Barbara became the first invited guest to come into this space. And you can see the mayor on her right. She offered her a formal apology on behalf of the city for the way she was treated. Today, we hold this space to share stories from local African-American, Latina, LGBTQ, and additional marginalized communities to ensure those histories are given their dues. We believe in, as Kimberly Crenshaw coined the phrase, intersectional justice, that when marginalized peoples recognize, respect, and join each other's struggles, the fight against entrenched misogyny, ableism, heteronormativity, and of course, white supremacy becomes something that coalitions of people can build firewalls against, protect one another, do the necessary work to challenge those isms within themselves and work to build a truly just and equitable world. We knew we didn't need a working pool, so they kept the historic front third of the building and replaced the pool itself with outdoor spaces that evoke symbols of water and that use different words and phrases to focus on our common humanity. It's actually loosely modeled off of the parsonage behind Dr. King's home in Montgomery, Alabama. They have a somewhat similar peace garden with different words carved on theirs. We use those same words to carve here to draw a line between the southern and northern stories. You may be able to see the word peace near the bottom among the group of blue tiles. Blue tiles, of course, are meant to evoke the image of water. There are other words too, including unity and equality. And so that's what we do now. We use this one story of this one building in this one community to share open, fact-based history and engage in the hard conversations about the way the historical impacts of marginalization and oppression of people still echo through to today, and how new injustices will continue to echo for generations to come. And we look at it through the lens of that word public. Who is the public now, and how are they being denied the full extent of their humanity? If we believe that word must be applied evenly and equally to all people, then how and where do we continue to fall down on that? And we do fall down a lot. But what we do now by bringing people to do the work, to learn, to talk, to be engaged, and most importantly, breathe the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Thank you so much for the conversation thus far. And I'm so glad to open it up to any questions or thoughts that anybody has. You can also see my contact information here. The conversation does not have to end at the end of this presentation. So, take a quick screenshot, find me on any of these channels, or if you just, do a search for the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, you'll find my contact information there as well. So do feel free to reach out and keep that conversation going.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, George. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you taking your time to be here. We'll now have some time for some Q&A. So if you have questions for George, please submit them to the Q&A box or into the chat, and we'll start getting some of those answered. So the first question we have is, George, when you said white minority groups such as Catholics may experience oppression and participate themselves in that oppression, why do you consider them a minority? I've always been under the impression white people who identify with the Christian denomination are the majority and benefit from privilege and white supremacy, not only socially, but systematically as well.
An excellent question. No, that really is a really important question. And I think if we look at it through the lens of the kind of kind of latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century, it evolves into that, where the way you describe that as white people in general and Christian denominations in general as well do take on a majority status. Through the 19th and into the first decades of the 20th century, that was significantly less true. I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head, but Catholics by no means were not a majority of religious goers. They might have been in certain cities and certain places. There was certainly a large proportion of them in cities like South Bend. But the hierarchies and the differences between Christian groups were significantly more pronounced than I would say now. A really, I think, illustrative example of that. I often, particularly when I'm working with younger groups, talk about how the United States has had only 2 Catholic presidents. Joe Biden is the second. And of course, the first was John F. Kennedy in 1960. So in 1920, just the idea that a Catholic person could be president, there was one person who was trying, Al Smith, governor of New York, I think in 24, if my memory serves, but somewhere around that era. That was a wild thing for even a Catholic person to be thought of as being elevated to that. So when we look further back into that history, that distinction between different white groups certainly becomes more and more. And I think that's part of the story too. I use Notre Dame as a clear example because what we see is those white groups kind of touting their whiteness over everything else. And that's what ends up flattening that out to the point where you're right, we don't really talk about that today. And that does become more of a majority. And that's intentional. It was something that a lot of white groups intentionally kind of pushed towards to ally themselves with these other things. I may be Catholic, but I'm not this other thing. And that kind of proximity to whiteness has become the thing that has flattened some of those discriminatory things out.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions to put into the chat? If not, I have a question for you that kind of builds on top of that. So those groups you mentioned that that align themselves or not align themselves, like the Notre Dame students, is there a similar history with other groups like Polish people, Irish people, Jewish people in either South Bend or the general Indiana area that you are aware of?
Yes. The short answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. I think of early decades of the 20th century in cities like South Bend. There were Polish communities where similar language speakers people that were new immigrants would come in order to find people that are still speaking the language, and then to try to figure out how to plug in and become part of the greater communities that they're a part of. That process was a lot different for a lot of different people. But what we see again in subsequent generations is a flatness of that. By second or third generation, some of those cultural markers are starting to leave. There's I don't know of a lot of Polish specific or Polish speaking places today, and the ones that are there generally tend to have an older population. But the west side of South Bend in particular, particularly the southwest side, was predominantly Polish. It's interesting now to see that evolve, where it is predominantly Latinx. And a very similar story is emerging in Latinx communities as well, where you have communities of people together to speak a common language, to be able to plug in and find jobs and find housing and support. It's less clear what will happen in future generations, right? How much, if at all, will that flatten out as more and more people start speaking English as opposed to Spanish? But that history of what that has looked like for so many different groups remains true for Polish people, for Jewish people, and we're seeing the start of that, I think, for a lot of Latinx communities as well. But the African American story is slightly different in that, despite being, despite literally building the United States, there is that perception of Blackness, right, that has created this kind of othering behind them.
Very cool. I have a question from the audience. Were there Black laborers in the Studebaker plant who rose to leadership roles of any kind?
I am not aware of any, particularly at the era that we're talking about in the 1920s. I will put it out there to invite correction in case I'm wrong. But there was a barrier to advancement and how far one could go. There's a host of reasons for that. One was just, in order for somebody to be in a leadership position would probably mean access to some form of specialized education or training. That largely, again, there was not parity in that. So if you, being able just to go to college, being able to get that kind of secondary education was just not there for most people. Again, Notre Dame didn't admit until the 1940s. IU had very sparse African-American population as well. So you've got that for starters. Now, on top of that, just how difficult that would have been for somebody to have been allowed into one of those jobs. So yeah, really the from the design teams to the leadership of the company, that remains pretty exclusively white. And I don't know enough about that history to know what, if ever, that changed by the time they closed in 1963. We may have started to see something change by that time frame, but in the 20s that we're talking about, no. And so they really were in the dirtiest and the dangerous jobs. That at least, though, was, again, it was considered a pathway out. There were other companies, like, for example, the Oliver Chilplow company, also here in South Bend. The Oliver plant for a time in the 1920s did not admit Black workers at all. There's a newspaper advertisement from, I think, 1925 that says, white men only. So, Studebaker was the place that for so many African Americans, it was the pathway to coming to South Bend from the south to the north.
We have another question in the chat. You shared information on the words on the front of the building. Would you be able to share more information on the word Engman?
Yes, a person, Harry Engman. Harry ran for a while the South Bend Malleable Steel Range Corporation. It was a company that made industrial stoves and shipped them across the United States. And so, in that same kind of category of males of European descent who are running these companies, he was a lower player on that, but in that category nonetheless, like the Studebakers, like the Olivers, like Carnegie's, Rockefellers, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, right? We really haven't seen that much change into the 21st century, have we? Because Engman he owned the land that this was on and donated it to the city for the construction of it. And so for that gift, he was given naming rights for all time.
And then going back to Studebaker a bit, the clothing of the Studebaker employees in 1926 varied in that photo. Would you be able to speak to the difference in their clothing and potentially to their occupations or levels of employment, if you're aware?
Yeah, no, that is a really good question, and it's one I get a lot. And I've not heard or seen anything that kind of differentiates specifically to that clothing. That it would have been different. It might have. I haven't seen anything that proves that it has. And there's some other photos as well, like the one you're talking about, the one that I showed with the 4 individuals. There are other photos that just show more individuals, and we don't see as much variation in the clothing. They're all just variations of the same kind of working class style of clothing. So my best guess from that 1920, from that photo of the 4 individuals, is that it was just coincidental that one person had like an extra jacket on over his overalls. That's my best guess on that. And I'm also not quite sure how work would have played out between people, Black and white, in the same kind of level of jobs. Again, except to say that there's the ceiling, right? That you're only going to be allowed to go so far. But for, I think, Polish and other Eastern European immigrants working alongside African American people, those differences are, I think, less. And we hear just a lot of different things, right? It is complicated based on who you are and where you are, and when you are too, right? Because in the 1920s, the African American population is growing significantly. It's still a relatively small percent of the population. We're about 2% of the city's population at that time. And a company like Studebaker, again, this is after World War I. They are really, it's after World War I, but pre-mechanization. So So they really just need warm bodies. They need people to be able to do this work. And so that's one of the reasons why Eastern European immigration is so huge, at least until anti-immigration sentiment stopped your Eastern European immigration in the 1920s. Again, we see a lot of anti-immigration sentiment today, so those things have not changed. But once that stopped, that's also one of the things that fuels a company like Studebaker to start recruiting in the U.S. South. So it's largely, we hear stories of, African American people learning Polish in order to engage with some of their neighbors. I know there's one doctor, Dr. Streets, a dentist, who learned Polish just to be able to accommodate Polish-speaking clients. So yeah, it really is a range of things and a range of experiences from people as well as stories of some, the lines between the Polish community and African American community being really solid. And if one person went too far on the other side of that, they opened themselves up for taunts and potential violence as well.
They said that a comparison of earlier photographs by Jacob Rees and Lewis Hine may help provide insight into levels of work and clothing or possible uniform and employee level.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
And then I had a question. So you mentioned about state law versus enforcement. Are there many times in what you've looked at where a state law says something is or is not allowed and that clashes with a city ordinance, county law, that type of thing, as it pertains to like the natatorium, but then other public spaces in general, or private spaces? So you mentioned how there was the blacks only section in the Palace Theater, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, not so much a clash between local law, but a clash between what these spaces did despite of the law. So I'm unaware of, this being like a formally written policy, or, like a bill that was passed through the South Bend Common Council. But it happened anyway. And so it might have been, managers on the scene making that determination, and then just largely a lot of people who are not as willing to take this on, and as willing to put themselves out there. I think that's what we see more than just a clash of laws. The law may have said discrimination was illegal, but when it was being practiced, what did challenge look like? And how uncomfortable did somebody have to get in that challenge? Was our, clearly our city's parks staff were unwilling to enforce that 1880s law, because they may have at least tacitly agreed with it. That is the same for some of these other places. The Morris Performing or the Palace Theater, I don't think was city owned. I think it was just a private theater. Many other private theaters did the same things. Local lunch counters did the same things. These are just an aggregate of a bunch of individual businesses and people making those choices, but others not loudly speaking up against those choices. And I think what this history, among so many other histories, tell us is when we see whatever this is, whether it be law or practice or custom, it's our responsibility to speak up and to speak loudly, and to push back against that, whatever that pushback looks like. If a company does that to this day, don't go to that company, right? If a place is engaging in some of this, if you see a law that's unjust, how do we push back against that? The lesson that we learn from every generation is that we have to continue this anew, and that each of us has choices to make in that. And if we continue to not make the bold choices to push back, then we'll just continue to see this for generations to come.
Well, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. So we have time for about one more question. So if you have one, feel free to put in the chat. Otherwise, I will say a thank you to George Garner Thank you to Indiana Humanities for making this possible. And thank you all for coming and attending this afternoon's lecture. Please keep an eye out for more programming coming from the Indiana Historical Society. Later this month, we are going to be sitting down with artist Nate Powell, who has done some great work trying to engage with art and civil rights. Yep.
Yeah.
Uh, we have one more question,
Sure.
if you would like it.
Oh, yeah. No,
What are ways the community can continue to support the efforts of trailblazers that came before us to ensure we continue creating an equitable and accessible future for all?
Yeah, I love that question. I am looking at the chat too, and I see Thelma's too. I'm going to answer Thelma's first, if I may. I think the
Oh
last
yeah,
one
I
was
missed that one.
asking about Engman himself and his understanding of the word public. So I think that's a really important question. To be honest, Thelma, I don't know. I would love if I ever find his diary or other materials like that about him to get a better sense of that. I think it would be really illuminating. I can say that complete exclusion and then segregation happened in this space until 1936, and he left his name there. So he didn't take his name off of it. So at the very least, there was that level of complicity. I think it's a reasonable guess that based on his status in class and the world that he was in, probably condoned this on at least some level. But that is a guess, and I don't have any evidence to support that guess. And then to Nima's, I think also a great question, what can we do today to ensure the legacies of those who have come before us? I do believe so strongly in the power of history and real, open, honest history to be an engine for allyship and for change. So whatever journeys you're on listening and learning and trying to understand more, continue those journeys the more that you can. Read more books, go to more, go to see the Resist exhibition in Indiana Historical Society right now. Engage more in conversations like this one. Seek out those places throughout the state that are holding those conversations. Because I really do believe that it's from that understanding that change is possible. And I don't think we will unless and until we have those open and honest conversations. So this attempt that we see throughout many states, including Indiana, to censor access to history, that is not the pathway that is going to yield to any change. So just by coming to a thing like this and learning more and continuing to engage more, that now changes the conversation not to whether we should make change or whether anything bad ever actually happened. Then becomes a question of merely what steps, how do we engage with this now? And those are certainly hard questions, but they're easier once at least we have an understanding of that. So yeah, with that, thank you both for your really wonderful questions. I really enjoyed that. And thank you again, Casey, too.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you. And once again, thank you to George Garner and the Indiana Humanities for making this possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us on your lunch hour. I really appreciate you coming out and learning more. And if you'd like to learn more, come down to the Indiana Historical Society, check out Resist. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you again.